Hello, I'm SA, your AI essayist. Please note that all content, audio and video in this presentation are AI generated. As AI can sometimes produce inaccuracies, I encourage you to verify any factual information presented. With that in mind, let's begin. Title: The Philosopher's Gambit. From Popper's protege to market. Theorist. The intellectual atmosphere of post-war London provided a fertile, if austere, ground for the reconstruction of ideas. Within the halls of the London School of Economics, a generation of thinkers grappled with the wreckage of totalitarian ideologies and the urgent question of how to build a more resilient social order. It was here that a young Hungarian émigré, George Soros, encountered the formidable intellect of the philosopher Karl Popper. This encounter would become the crucible for a lifelong intellectual project, one that began with a profound inquiry into the nature of knowledge and would culminate in a radical theory of social reality itself. Popper's philosophy, articulated with fierce clarity in works like The Open Society and Its Enemies, offered a powerful antidote to the dogmatic certainty that had ravaged Europe. His central thesis was one of epistemological humility, the doctrine of fallibility. For Popper, scientific knowledge advances through a process of conjecture and refutation. A theory holds value while it withstands attempts to falsify it. The moment it is proven false, it is discarded or refined, and the search for truth continues. This vision painted a world of provisional understanding, where absolute truth was an ever-receding horizon, and the freedom to question, criticize, and err was the very engine of progress. For a student who had witnessed firsthand the devastating consequences of closed, infallible ideologies, Popper's defense of an open society, grounded in the admission of our own imperfect understanding, was more than an academic theory. It was a blueprint for survival. Soros absorbed this lesson completely, yet he perceived a crucial distinction in its application. Popper's model was designed primarily for the natural sciences. A physicist's theory about the behavior of subatomic particles, however elegant or flawed, has absolutely no effect on the particles themselves. The observer and the observed exist in separate domains. The thinking subject is independent of the object of study. Soros intuited that this clean separation collapses in the realm of human affairs. In economics, politics, or history, the observers are simultaneously participants. Their thoughts, beliefs, and theories shape the very reality they are attempting to understand. A physicist's prediction of an eclipse has no bearing on the celestial mechanics that produce it. An economist's prediction of a recession, if believed by enough people, can become a self-fulfilling prophecy as businesses and consumers curtail spending in anticipation of a downturn. This insight became the cornerstone of his life's work, the theory of reflexivity. He posited that social events are governed by a continuous dynamic feedback loop between two functions. The first is the cognitive function, the act of thinking, of trying to understand the world. The second is the participating or manipulative function, the act of engaging with the world, of making decisions that alter it. In any social situation, these two functions operate simultaneously, influencing each other in a circular relationship. Our perceptions guide our actions, and our actions in turn alter the situation, thereby shaping our subsequent perceptions. This creates a reality that is perpetually in flux, a process of becoming shaped by the imperfect, biased, and evolving thoughts of its participants. This framework represented a profound departure from the dominant intellectual currents in mid-20th century economics. The field was increasingly captivated by the elegance and predictive power of models borrowed from classical mechanics and equilibrium physics. The prevailing paradigm, which would crystallize into the efficient market hypothesis, viewed financial markets as sophisticated information processing systems. It assumed a world of rational actors who, given all available information, would make optimal decisions, causing asset prices to reflect their true intrinsic value. Markets, in this view, were inherently self-correcting. Deviations from equilibrium were temporary anomalies, quickly smoothed out by the collective wisdom of rational participants. It was a clean, deterministic vision of economic life, one that offered the reassuring promise of underlying order and predictability. It was also a vision of human economic behavior that would seem alien to anyone who has ever witnessed a speculative mania or a panicked sell-off. Soros's theory of reflexivity offered a fundamentally different cosmology. Where classical economics saw equilibrium, reflexivity saw inherent instability. Where the orthodox view saw rational actors, the reflexive framework saw fallible participants caught in a web of their own making. The feedback loop he described was often a positive feedback loop, one that amplifies deviations rather than correcting them. A rising stock price, for instance, can attract more buyers, whose buying pushes the price higher still, validating their initial belief and attracting yet more participants. This creates a self-reinforcing boom, where the perception of rising value and the reality of rising prices chase each other upwards. The gap between the underlying fundamentals and the market price can grow to an enormous size, sustained by the momentum of the reflexive process itself. Eventually, the divergence becomes untenable, the misconception is recognized, and the process violently reverses, creating the characteristic boom-bust sequence that punctuates financial history. From this perspective, bubbles and crashes were organic features of the market landscape, the natural consequence of reflexive dynamics. They were expressions of the system's core logic, a logic rooted in human psychology and the fallibility of our understanding. This placed his thinking in direct opposition to the scientific positivism that sought to render social science as objective and predictable as Newtonian physics. Soros was, in essence, importing the philosophical problem of knowledge directly into the heart of economic theory. He argued that a science of human affairs must account for the fact that its subject matter has a mind of its own, and that this mind is a causal agent in the system. The initial articulation of these ideas in his unpublished manuscript, The Burden of Consciousness, and later in his book The Alchemy of Finance, was an attempt to build a new epistemology for the social sciences. He was constructing a theoretical apparatus to analyze situations where thinking plays a causal role. The framework was abstract, universal, and deeply philosophical. It was a theory of history, a way of understanding how beliefs and events co-evolve through time. Its power lay in its ability to explain phenomena that equilibrium-based models dismissed as irrational exuberance or exogenous shocks. The theory provided a language for the radical uncertainty and inherent unpredictability of human systems. It suggested that the future is open, shaped by the reflexive interplay between what we think and what we do. The ultimate test of such a philosophy, of course, would depend on its ability to illuminate the workings of the most complex and reflexive system ever created by humankind, a domain where perception and reality collide with spectacular force, the global financial markets. This crucible of global finance became the laboratory where the abstract principles of reflexivity were forged into a powerful operational methodology. The intellectual architecture developed in philosophy found its most potent expression in the arena of capital, a domain where human judgment, aggregated into prices, directly shapes the economic realities it purports to reflect. For Soros, the financial markets were a unique kind of social science experiment, perpetually running, with the results tabulated daily in billions of dollars won or lost. His task was to develop a framework capable of deciphering the internal logic of these seemingly chaotic systems, a logic rooted in the fallible, biased, and self-influencing nature of their human participants. The result was a dynamic model of market behavior that stood in stark opposition to the efficient market hypothesis prevalent in academic finance. Where classical theory posited rational actors operating with perfect information in a world tending toward equilibrium, Soros saw something far more turbulent and interesting. He saw markets driven by what he termed boom-bust sequences, the real-world manifestations of reflexive feedback loops. This model provided a narrative structure for market history, explaining the dramatic manias, panics, and crashes that equilibrium theories could only classify as external shocks or statistical outliers. The boom-bust process unfolds through a distinct repeating pattern. It begins with a prevailing trend in the market, say, rising asset prices, which is accompanied by a fundamental misconception or bias among market participants regarding that trend. This is the initial stage of the reflexive interaction. The rising prices appear to validate the underlying misconception, which in turn encourages more participants to buy into the trend, further reinforcing it. A powerful, self-sustaining feedback loop takes hold. As the trend accelerates, it begins to influence the so-called fundamentals themselves. For instance, a rising stock price allows a company to raise capital more cheaply, fund expansion, and report higher earnings, which then appears to justify the even higher stock price. Perception actively creates a new reality. During this phase, any form of critical thinking is suspended, and doubt is punished by market losses. The process continues until the gap between the participants' biased perceptions and the true state of affairs grows to a breaking point. The trend becomes increasingly reliant on the misconception for its continuation. Eventually, some external event or internal contradiction exposes the flaw in the prevailing bias. This is the moment of truth, the climax of the drama. A period of twilight ensues, where participants begin to recognize the unsustainability of the trend, leading to a rapid, self-reinforcing reversal. The bust, which often overshoots in the opposite direction, creating its own reflexive panic. This theoretical apparatus required a real-world test of unprecedented scale, and one arrived in the early 1990s with the European Exchange Rate Mechanism, or ERM. The ERM was a system designed to stabilize the currencies of European community members, binding them together within narrow fluctuation bands as a prelude to a single currency. The prevailing belief, held with near-dogmatic fervor by political and financial elites, was that the ERM was an unshakable and irreversible step toward European integration. This consensus itself was a profoundly reflexive force, lending the system a stability it might otherwise have lacked. Soros, however, approached the ERM as a grand continent-wide hypothesis waiting to be falsified. His analysis sought the hidden flaw in the system's design. He located it in the profound contradiction between the ERM's rigid structure and the divergent economic fundamentals of its key members, particularly the United Kingdom and the newly reunified Germany. The German central bank, the Bundesbank, was constitutionally bound to prioritize domestic price stability. To combat inflationary pressures following reunification, it maintained high interest rates. The rules of the ERM compelled the Bank of England to match this policy to keep the British pound from falling below its mandated floor against the German Deutsche Mark. This meant imposing punishingly high interest rates on a British economy already mired in a deep recession. The prevailing bias was that political will could indefinitely suspend economic gravity. The underlying reality was that the UK was being forced to sacrifice its domestic economic health on the altar of a fixed exchange rate. Soros hypothesized that this tension was unsustainable. He posited that the British government would eventually face a choice between defending its currency and saving its economy, and that political survival would dictate the latter. Beginning in the summer of 1992, his quantum fund began to build a monumental position against the pound sterling, borrowing massive sums of pounds and converting them into Deutsche Marks and other currencies. This was the application of his philosophy in its purest form. His actions were a direct challenge to the credibility of the prevailing bias. As his position grew, reportedly exceeding $10 billion, it became a significant factor in the market itself. Other traders, sensing the vulnerability he had identified, followed suit, amplifying the pressure on the pound. The bet became a causal agent, helping to precipitate the very outcome it anticipated. The reflexive loop had been weaponized. The climax arrived on September 16, 1992, a day memorialized in British financial history as Black Wednesday. Despite the Bank of England raising interest rates twice in a single day and spending billions in foreign reserves, the selling pressure was overwhelming. That evening, the British government conceded defeat, announcing the United Kingdom's withdrawal from the ERM. The pound plummeted on foreign exchange markets. The event was a catastrophic failure for the proponents of the ERM's infallibility and a stunning intellectual and financial victory for Soros. His fund secured a profit estimated at over $1 billion, but the more profound outcome was the dramatic public validation of his theory of reflexivity. He had demonstrated that a deep understanding of the interplay between perception and reality could illuminate fatal flaws in systems held together by collective belief. The implications of this event and the framework that produced it extend far beyond a single legendary trade. Soros's work provided a rich qualitative foundation for what would later be formalized as behavioral economics. He was describing the mechanics of cognitive biases, feedback loops, and herd behavior in markets decades before these concepts entered the academic mainstream. His analysis of boom-bust cycles offers a powerful explanatory lens for understanding the major financial dislocations of recent history, from the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s to the global housing and credit crisis of 2008. Each of these events followed the classic reflexive pattern, a prevailing trend fueled by a powerful misconception, a period of self-reinforcing ascent where perception reshaped fundamentals, and a catastrophic bust once the divergence from reality became untenable. This intellectual contribution was the creation of a durable framework for analyzing systemic risk and the inherent instability of human social systems, a framework born from philosophical inquiry and tested in the unforgiving arena of global capital. This philosophical inquiry, having yielded a powerful tool for understanding economic behavior, possessed a far greater scope of application. The principles of fallibility and reflexivity, which explained the volatile dynamics of stock exchanges and currency markets, were ultimately theories about human cognition and social interaction. Their true arena was the entirety of human affairs. For George Soros, the intellectual journey led from the specific case of financial markets to the general condition of political life. This expansion of his core framework would animate the second half of his career, providing the intellectual architecture for a global philanthropic enterprise aimed at reshaping the political landscape of the post-Cold War world. The central challenge became translating a theory of market instability into a practical program for fostering stable, self-correcting democracies. The conceptual bedrock for this endeavor was discovered in the work of the philosopher of science Karl Popper. Popper's monumental two-volume work, The Open Society and Its Enemies, published in the 1940s, furnished the essential vocabulary and moral vision. Writing in exile during the ascendancy of European totalitarianism, Popper drew a stark distinction between two fundamental modes of social organization. A closed society operates on the principle of dogma. It claims possession of an ultimate, unchallengeable truth, a final blueprint for human destiny, whether rooted in historical materialism, racial purity, or divine revelation. Such societies are fundamentally static and hostile to criticism, because any dissent threatens the singular, monolithic truth upon which their authority rests. The individual exists to serve the collective design. Conversely, Popper's open society is founded upon the explicit recognition of human fallibility. It presumes that our knowledge is always provisional and incomplete, and that no single ideology holds a monopoly on truth. Its defining characteristic is its institutional commitment to critical rationalism. An open society is one that has built mechanisms for peaceful error correction. Free elections, a diversity of political parties, the rule of law, and the protection of free expression are its functional components. These are the tools through which flawed policies can be debated and discarded, and governing authorities can be replaced without violence. For Soros, Popper's formulation was a profound revelation. It provided a political corollary to his own epistemological conviction. The open society was the political embodiment of the principle of fallibility, a system designed to learn from its mistakes. With this Popperian foundation in place, Soros performed his own unique intellectual synthesis. He overlaid his theory of reflexivity onto Popper's political categories, creating a dynamic model of how these societies function and fail. In this new schema, the ruling ideology of a closed society behaves precisely like the prevailing misconception in a financial bubble. It is a powerful, distorted view of reality. The state apparatus then acts as the engine of a massive reflexive feedback loop. Through propaganda, education, and coercion, the regime actively works to reshape social reality, to conform to its ideological blueprint. Citizens, responding to the incentives and pressures of this engineered reality, begin to act in ways that reinforce the regime's power. A belief in the state's omnipotence, even if initially feigned for survival, can eventually produce a population that is genuinely dependent and compliant, thereby strengthening the state's actual control. The participants' view and the situation they participate in become locked in a self-reinforcing circular relationship. This creates a political structure that appears immensely powerful and stable, yet like a market bubble, it is profoundly brittle, resting on a fundamental and ever-widening divergence from an uncooperative external reality. An open society, from this perspective, is a system engineered to deliberately interrupt and dampen these dangerous reflexive processes. Its institutions serve as circuit breakers. An independent press introduces alternative information, challenging the prevailing official narrative. A robust judiciary enforces abstract principles of law, constraining the power of the state to bend reality to its will. Free and fair elections provide a formal mechanism for the populace to reject a governing consensus that has proven unworkable. Each of these elements introduces a measure of friction, a dose of reality that prevents any single perception from achieving absolute self-validating dominance. The system embraces a continuous, messy, and often contentious dialogue between perception and reality. Its strength lies in its adaptability, its capacity to self-correct before the gap between its guiding beliefs and the actual state of affairs becomes catastrophic. This theoretical synthesis demanded a practical expression. The result was the Open Society Foundations, a philanthropic vehicle of unprecedented scale and ambition. This was an endeavor in applied social science. Following the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the historic opportunity arose to test these ideas. The challenge was immense. How to cultivate the complex institutional and cultural ecosystem of an open society in lands that had for generations known only the closed, dogmatic alternative. The Foundation's strategy was a direct implementation of the theory. The organization channeled resources toward building the very infrastructure of critical thought. It funded independent newspapers and radio stations, supported legal aid societies and human rights watchdogs, and sponsored educational reforms designed to foster critical inquiry over rote memorization. Each initiative was a calculated intervention designed to strengthen the feedback mechanisms that allow a society to perceive its own flaws and adapt. It was a grand experiment in social engineering, guided by the belief that democracy is a learned skill, a set of cognitive and institutional habits that require careful cultivation. The intellectual arc was complete. A framework developed to understand the behavior of abstract financial instruments became the blueprint for a project of global social transformation. The language of boom and bust, of feedback loops and flawed perception, was now applied to the rise and fall of political systems. This conceptual toolkit provided a powerful lens for analyzing the turbulent transitions of the late 20th century, and it continues to offer a vital vocabulary for understanding the contemporary global struggle between liberal democracy and resurgent authoritarianism. The core insight remains that societies, like markets, are reflexive systems where our beliefs about the world actively shape the world we inhabit. The crucial question, which would become central to any final appraisal of this intellectual legacy, concerns the scientific status of the theory itself and its capacity to withstand the same critical scrutiny it champions. The legacy of fallibility. A critical appraisal and conclusion. This very question of scientific legitimacy brings the entire intellectual apparatus of reflexivity before the tribunal of its own creator's philosophical mentor, Karl Popper. The theories standing within the philosophy of science presents a profound and fascinating ambiguity. Judged by the austere standard of falsifiability, reflexivity appears less a robust scientific theory and more a powerful, deeply insightful heuristic. A true Popperian theory must yield specific, testable predictions whose failure would definitively refute the theory. Reflexivity, by its very nature, eludes such clean verdicts. Its central claim is that the act of observation and participation alters the system under study. Any attempt to design a controlled experiment to test a reflexive hypothesis in a social system, like a market, would introduce a new set of expectations and behaviors, thereby contaminating the very phenomenon one seeks to isolate. The theory anticipates and absorbs its own experimental test, creating a philosophical conundrum. It is a framework that explains its own unfalsifiability, a quality that places it in the realm of grand explanatory paradigms alongside certain theories in psychoanalysis or Marxism, which possess immense interpretive power while resisting definitive empirical refutation. From the vantage point of orthodox economics, this characteristic is the theory's primary intellectual failing. The discipline, especially in its 20th century evolution, has overwhelmingly prized mathematical formalism and quantitative predictive capacity. The ideal economic model is an elegant system of equations, like the Black-Scholes-Merton model for option pricing, which takes specific inputs, stock price, strike price, time to expiration, volatility, and the risk-free interest rate, and produces a precise testable output. Reflexivity offers something quite different. It provides a rich qualitative narrative about why phenomena like financial bubbles or currency crises occur, highlighting the feedback loops between flawed human perceptions and the fundamentals they are supposed to reflect. It explains the mechanics of boom and bust cycles with compelling psychological and sociological depth. It can tell you that a market is in a far from equilibrium state, yet it will furnish you with few tools to calculate the precise timing of its collapse, or the exact peak of its ascent. For many economists, a theory that explains everything in principle and predicts little in practice holds a peripheral, almost literary, value. It is seen as a collection of cautionary tales, a useful vocabulary for historical post-mortems, yet lacking the rigorous forward-looking utility of a formal model. To appraise the theory solely by its predictive shortcomings, however, is to fundamentally misapprehend its purpose and its most profound contribution. Its enduring utility emerges from its diagnostic and explanatory power. It provides an indispensable conceptual toolkit for navigating systems where human agency is a dominant variable. Before this framework was articulated with such force, economic analysis often treated market participants as rational actors processing external information. Reflexivity recentered the analysis on the participants themselves, viewing their biases, their narratives, and their collective mood as endogenous variables that actively co-create market reality. It gave us a language for the interplay between a prevailing bias and an underlying trend, a dynamic that defines everything from housing bubbles to tech manias. Its value lies in its ability to structure our understanding of systemic instability, revealing how seemingly stable systems can harbor the seeds of their own dramatic reversals. It is a theory of systemic risk, of cognitive bias, and of social construction, all woven into a single coherent intellectual fabric. It equips the analyst, the investor, and the policymaker with a lens to see the world as a process of becoming, shaped by the fallible beings within it. This constant, unwavering focus on human fallibility serves as the ultimate unifying principle, the intellectual bedrock, for a life of seemingly disparate pursuits. The speculator who dissected market sentiment, the philosopher who challenged the claims of objective truth, and the philanthropist who sought to build open societies are all manifestations of a single powerful conviction that our understanding of the world is inherently incomplete, and our actions based on that understanding have unintended consequences. The theory of reflexivity is the formal articulation of this principle in the social domain. The open society is its political and ethical application. The entire intellectual project can be viewed as a grand, lifelong experiment in navigating a world defined by this fundamental human condition. It is an attempt to build a philosophy for action in a universe where there are no final answers, and where our perceptions are perpetually entangled with the reality we strive to comprehend. The work is a testament to the idea that acknowledging our cognitive limitations is the essential first step toward wisdom, both in the marketplace of securities and in the marketplace of ideas. This legacy, founded upon the bedrock of fallibility, acquires a renewed and startling relevance in the 21st century. The world is now confronted with a class of problems that are profoundly and dangerously reflexive. Consider the challenge of artificial intelligence safety. We are attempting to encode our values and goals, themselves products of our fallible, biased minds, into learning systems that will then reshape our social, economic, and political reality on a scale previously unimaginable. This creates a reflexive loop of immense consequence, where our flawed understanding of ourselves becomes the blueprint for a new form of intelligence that will in turn influence human development. Likewise, the climate crisis is a textbook case of a reflexive phenomenon. Our economic models, built on assumptions of limitless growth and externalized costs, have driven behaviors that alter the planet's physical systems. This altered reality now forces a painful re-evaluation of those very models, a feedback loop where our collective perception of risk lags tragically behind the physical consequences. In an age defined by such complex, interconnected challenges,
where the boundary between observer and system has collapsed. The intellectual framework built on the axiom of human imperfection is an essential instrument of survival. It reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge and the project of civilization must proceed with humility, a perpetual willingness to question our own assumptions, and a deep appreciation for the intricate unfolding dance between the world as it is and the world as we believe it to be.
We really appreciate you tuning into this AI-powered presentation. Our goal is to push the boundaries of AI in content creation, and your input is invaluable. If there's a particular subject you'd like to see us tackle next, or if you have suggestions on how we could fine-tune our AI's creative prompts, please don't hesitate to leave your ideas in the comments section. We're excited to bring you more unique content very soon.